Millions of jobs will disappear. This is the most transformative technology that's ever happened for humans. You actually can make the system work without humans consuming stuff.
Erik Brynjolfsson is one of the world's leading authorities
on how artificial intelligence is transforming the economy,
the labor market, and humanity's future.
Where there's a small number of individuals, or even one, that controls all of the wealth and power, or the vast majority of it. So we need to lean against that.
A Stanford professor and director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, he has shaped the global debate on technology for decades.
I think it's bigger than the Industrial Revolution, and it's happening 10 times faster. There was a student who came to my office a little bit over a month ago. She was a graduating senior from Stanford University. She said most of her classmates did not have jobs, and her exact words were, "Is my generation doomed?" Well, I have some bad news.
We've been hearing from AI CEOs over the past year that they are going to essentially wipe out white-collar labor. And these days, they're saying that they are going to augment it. What's actually going on?
Well, there's truth to both of those things. I don't quite understand why they whipsawed so far from one side to the other. That said, I think there's way too much emphasis, both by the Frontier Lab folks and from a lot of CEOs of regular companies, on the eliminating jobs side of it, when really most of the value is in augmenting and creating new opportunities. You know, I was talking to this chief financial officer just a few weeks ago, and she was telling me that, she really wanted to measure AI's ROI more carefully. I said, that's great. You really should measure the benefits. Don't just take it on faith. And she said, absolutely. And that's why she's going to start requiring each of her departments in the company, it's a very large Fortune 500 company, to report how much headcount reduction they had due to AI. And I said, that's a terrible measure. I mean, yes, it's great to save money, to save costs, but headcount reduction is such a narrow measure, and it's all focused on the cost savings and the replacement side, whereas most of the value in the long run comes from doing new things that were never done before. That's a much more sustainable competitive advantage, and not enough people do it. That said, it's harder to do those kinds of measures. So the focus is often on the easy to measure headcount reduction rather than the thing that takes a little bit more creativity. But if you're a CFO, making millions of dollars, that's why you make the big money, is to come up with these new KPIs, these new performance metrics that understand how the benefits can be broader.
Why is that? I mean, on a fundamental level, why is the mental model such that we should reduce headcount? Maybe partially it's because of the media narrative, right?
It's partly because of the media narrative. It's a cognitive bias. It's much easier to look at something that already exists and say, how can we have a machine do the same thing? How can we save costs? And, Alan Turing famously had this thing, the Turing test. And his idea was the definition of AI was to look at what humans were currently doing and how well can you imitate that. And if you can make it indistinguishable, a perfect imitation, then you have achieved AI. And he said that in 1950, but it's been sort of an implicit focus for many years, sometimes an explicit focus. Niels Nielsen, who is a professor here at Stanford, he operationalized Alan Turing's idea by saying we should look at each of the tasks in the economy, each of the jobs that people are doing and all the tasks in those jobs, and have AI replace each of them. And when we got to 100%, then we would achieve, full AI. Again, think about it. It's looking at what already exists and how to replace it. But I want you to imagine a Venn diagram. We don't have a whiteboard here. I'm a professor, so I'm at a disadvantage. But imagine a Venn diagram. In one circle, this circle is all the things that humans can do. A lot of things in that circle. And right now there's a little circle inside of it, which is what machines can do, and it's gradually growing. And Alan Turing and Niels Nielsen and many others imagined that we should try to have the little circle of what AI can do fill the entire circle of what all humans can do. It sounds very ambitious. I think it's not nearly ambitious. It's actually the wrong focus. Outside of the circle of what we are currently doing is a much bigger space, this whole room. That's all the things we've never done before. The new things we can do in combination with machines and humans working together. New discoveries, new goods and services. That's where we should be focusing, the new space. Now, what I just said to you is a little bit conceptual. Let me make it a little bit more concrete. In my paper, The Turing Trap, I tell a story of the mythological engineer whose name was Daedalus. He made wax wings and many other things. According to legend, Daedalus made robots, humanoid robots, that were so lifelike they were indistinguishable from humans. They walked and talked just like humans. I'm pretty sure it was just a myth, but let's suppose that it actually was true. And suppose he had taken Niels Nielsen's instructions and had those robots do all of the work of the ancient Athenians. So instead of Athenians making clay pots, the robots would make clay pots, chariots, tunics. If you became sick, instead of having a human burn incense for you, the robot would burn incense to make you feel better. And pretty soon there would be no more need for humans to work at all. All the work would be done by robots. But would they really have lifted the living standards that much? This room would be filled with clay pots. We would have sick people have all the incense that they need. But fundamentally, we wouldn't have, jet engines, mRNA vaccines, iPhones, all the things that really lifted living standards over the past 2,000 years. So I think it's very clear that merely copying the tasks that we're doing today and having machines do them is a small fraction of the real value. I mean, there's nothing wrong with not having to make clay pots by hand anymore, but that's not the big value you get from a new technology. Most of the technologies over the past 2,000 years were doing new things. And I don't think we're at the end of history. Most of the value from new technologies, including AI, will be doing new things and filling this room and the whole world with new discoveries and new inventions. So that CFO, the people at the Frontier AI labs, all of us as citizens, let's stop focusing on replacing what humans do and focus instead on doing new things together, working together, that we never could have done before.
Maybe there are some industries that are more like ancient Athens as compared to the 2,000 years of growth that we've seen. There's only so much innovation one could do in legal services, say, or in professional services in general, where it is really about there is a bundle of tasks that probably won't expand more than it is right now. What should one do if one's a lawyer or a consultant or...
Totally. No, that's fair. And I'm not saying we should put no effort into reducing work or eliminating existing tasks. I'm just saying that that's not the big story. Absolutely. Let's get rid of, reviewing boxes of documents to find that one keyword. And there's all sorts of other boring drudgery or just dangerous work. And I'm all for replacing that. And there's nothing wrong with having more leisure time. I'm all for that. My point is that we have an excessive focus, whether it's the researchers like Niels Nielsen, who's a brilliant guy, by the way, and so is Alan Turing, obviously. But their focus was too much on what's doing now. And many managers, when I work with my company, WorkHelix, we visit many companies. And this pattern over and over of always focusing on, not always, but disproportionately focusing on reducing costs, it's great. Reduce costs if you can, but don't miss the big story of doing new things. Not just because it's better for the world, but also it's better for the company because it creates a more sustainable competitive advantage. And by the way, it's better for the workers too. There's a lot of fear right now. People, I think, are legitimately worried about their jobs disappearing. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Millions of jobs will disappear. But there's also going to be millions of new jobs created. And a smart CEO or CFO or CTO or engineer is going to say, let's focus on those new things we can create. And now your workforce is going to join you. People want to produce new goods and services. They want to produce better quality. They want to have happier customers. Give them the tools to do that, and your workforce is going to be with you instead of against you.
In focusing on the jobs being destroyed, are there any policy solutions that are on the table that may actually lessen the burden on people from middle class, upper middle class, from the services sector?
I hear that question a lot. With all due respect, it's the wrong question. We should not try to stop this transition. No society, no company, no individual who ever tried to freeze history and prevent the transition has ever succeeded. We don't want to save all the old coal mining jobs or the jobs looking at boxes of documents that lawyers have been doing. We need to embrace the change and lean into it. I think the right question is, how do we make the transition smoother? How do we embrace these new jobs? And there are lots of them that are coming, and make that happen more gracefully and smoothly. I think we're doing a really bad job of it right now, but trying to freeze in place the old system is a guaranteed failure. And in fact, by the way, it's more risky than embracing. It seems risky to lean into the dynamism, but ultimately, America has been a country of great dynamism, where people move from one geography to another, from one job to another. There's a great deal of social mobility, at least there used to be. There's less than there used to be. And I think if we go back and rekindle that spirit of dynamism, then the technology is going to be our friend rather than our enemy.
Maybe it's partly a failure of imagination in terms of trying to, imagine what those jobs are.
It's very hard. Absolutely. I can't even imagine. Nobody can imagine them. You know whose job it is to imagine them? Entrepreneurs. That is what they do. And by the way, most of them fail. I was talking to Vinod Khosla. He's a very successful venture capitalist here. And he's happy if 10% of his firms are 10% of his investments are big winners. That's where it's very much a power law distribution. But he makes lots of bets, and that's what you have to do. You have to try. You have to be dynamic about it, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also exhilarating. And what we need to do is create a safety net that allows people to take those risks and then bounce back. A lot of entrepreneurs come from middle-class families because they know, and upper-class families because they know that, hey, if this fails, hey, my parents are going to protect me or whatever. And that gives them a chance to try something. I'd love to have that safety net for everybody in America, everybody in the world. Denmark, I was born in Denmark, has this system they call flex security. Flexibility and security. They're not opposites. You can have both of them with portable health benefits, portable retirement, some basic guarantees, childcare, et cetera. Companies can try new things. If they don't work out, they fire everybody. That sounds terrible, but the people still have all those benefits and security, and now they can try something new. And they keep trying new things, and that's ultimately how you get dynamism.
What about the solutions that are often proposed when we look, maybe 5, 10, 15 years into the future, where we have trillion-dollar companies.
We already have trillion-dollar companies.
Measured in like dozens.
$10 trillion companies, $100 trillion. You got to be more ambitious.
That's precisely the point. Yeah. There is so much value that accrues to the owners of capital vis-a-vis the labor, which, there may be new jobs, but there is still the transition. People are falling into the cracks. What about the universal basic incomes of the world?
Well, that world you just described is one of the things that I'm most worried about. I'm very optimistic that the technology is going to create a lot of wealth, and I think that there's lots of paths to doing that. I'm very worried that wealth will be very concentrated, and concentrated wealth tends to lead to concentrated power. Economic and political power. And for most of us, that's not a world we want, where there's a small number of individuals or even one that controls all of the wealth and power, or the vast majority of it. So we need to lean against that. And that's why I coined this term, the Turing Trap. Trying to make AI a perfect imitation of humans, the way Alan Turing described it. Some people find that appealing, but I got to say that it's a trap. Because if AI mimics humans, then there's no longer any need for human labor. And the thing about human labor is it's widely dispersed. Everybody has some power, has some contribution. Now, we could do something like you mentioned, universal basic income, and then basically this central entity that creates a lot of power, this small group of entities that creates a lot of power, and wealth, gives out the money to people. And, in some ways, it could be worse, I imagine. On the other hand, that loss of agency, that loss of power is something a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. And they should feel uncomfortable with it because they're at the mercy. If that central entity decides, you know what, we're going to give you 30% less next year. What can you do? You stamp your feet. You say, oh, that's not nice. You have no bargaining power. If you have labor and your labor is essential, or if you own other assets, now you have bargaining power. And for most of the past couple of hundred years, the power of labor has actually grown. Human capital has become more important. And that gave us leverage. If you don't pay the doctor's going to say, well, then I'm not going to provide services. So then you have to pay them. You have to pay the factory worker. You have to pay the farmer, the lawyer you mentioned. They all have some leverage. And that makes, they're not getting paid out of kindness. They're getting paid because they have bargaining power. They contribute something to the production system. So I want to stay away from the Turing Trap, where all the power is in this entity that replicates humans. And I want to have a world where humans continue to be important. And the longer we can extend that period, hopefully for decades, the longer period we're going to have where people continue to add value. One of the things we saw in some of my research was that AI is very spiky,
right?
In the sense that there's some things it can do amazingly well. It can solve, math problems that no human mathematician ever solved before. Obviously, it can go through millions of documents on the internet and elsewhere. And other times, it makes foolish mistakes. It can't count the number of the times the letter R appears in the word strawberry or something very simple like that. And it's weird that it could be so good at some things and bad at other things.
Right, solve the Erdos problem.
Solve the Erdos problem, but not be able to do simple spelling. I think it's actually a good thing that AI is so spiky. And if anything, we should be building those spikes even higher because that means, and humans are also spiky, but they're spiky in different ways. So instead of having them line up perfectly, we each have our strengths. We can ask the right questions. AI can execute them well, and other kinds of complementarities like that. As an economist, I know that the more different two entities are, the more the gains from trade are, from them working together. They each are important. On the other hand, if we make AI that perfectly mimics humans, now the gains from trade disappear. There's no longer a need for humans in the production function. I prefer the first world, where we continue to have a vital use. And my advice to AI researchers, stop focusing so much on doing things that are very hard for machines, but easy for humans, like walking upstairs, buttoning, answering simple questions, spelling words. I know that there's a lot of focus on trying to level up the weaknesses of these models. I would say instead focus on things that are easy for machines and hard for humans, solving the Erdos problem, doing these millions of documents. That's where the real value is going to be. And so we need to change our research agenda. We need to change the way that CFO thinks about where she should be focusing the efforts of her staff using computers. And each of us as workers need to be changing our mindset. The more we can differentiate ourselves and think of these technologies as tools that allow us to do new things we've never done before, it's going to create more value, fill the room with new inventions. It's also going to create more bargaining power for humans. So it's a win, both in terms of the size of the pie and also the distribution of the pie.
When we look at the darker scenario that you mentioned, when labor is out of the production function, like, who actually pays for the consumer goods? Like, do we have an economic toolkit to even conceptualize a world where there's little to no power that labor has? Like, the entire economic machine rests on consumption, right? And the machines don't really consume, do they?
Well, I have some bad news. And the bad news is that you actually can make the system work without humans consuming stuff. I hate to say this, but there are some countries where there's extreme inequality. There's a small number of rich people, and they do most of the consumption, and millions of poor people who consume almost nothing. And the numbers add up. I wish they didn't, but they did. And you can run a system like that almost indefinitely. So the economic contradictions are not automatically going to prevent us from getting to that world of extreme concentration. If we want to stop the world of extreme concentration, we need to make conscious choices that we do that, because it is possible for a small group of wealthy people, or for that matter, wealthy machines, to just produce stuff for themselves and leave everybody else out of the picture.
Like in the Keynes analogy of essentially digging a hole and then putting the dirt back into the hole.
Well,
right?
you can. There's things you can do. That's not necessarily what I would recommend. But what I would say is, again, what I'd like to do is keep humans in the production process as long as possible. I also want to find other ways to give humans bargaining leverage, and there are things that are being explored. Universal basic compute, where we all own a share of the compute. My course is really that I teach here at Stanford, and also my masterclass. We were talking about that before we went on air. They both have as their focus, how can we use these tools to create new things that we couldn't have done before? How can we become more entrepreneurial? And I think that, for a long time is where we're going to have the best success, is don't focus on replacing humans, but rather focus on amplifying humans to do new things. There was a student who came to my office a little bit over a month ago. She was a graduating senior from Stanford University, and she was very distraught. She said she didn't have a job. She said most of her classmates did not have jobs. And her exact words were, "Is my generation doomed?" I felt bad for her because she was obviously very worried. And I had to be honest, it is tough. There are falling job employment prospects in many types of categories compared to what there were before. But I also emphasized to her that while some jobs are disappearing, there are these new opportunities being created. In my class, everybody in the classroom is using tools like Replit and Cursor to create software. Even if they've never coded before, they now are creating working products. At the end of the quarter, everybody in class is going to be delivering a working product, not a PowerPoint presentation, not a bunch of words. They have to deliver something that actually works. And that's something that would have been impossible a year ago or 5 years ago. And this is the big opportunity. So that student who came to my office, I told her she should be on that side of it. She should be looking at the new things that she could do that she could never have done a year ago. And there's millions of people who now have opportunities they didn't have before. That's the part we should be leaning into. Don't focus on what's being destroyed. Move on from that. Focus on the new things that are being created. And I admit, it's awkward, it's rough, it's a little bit uncertain, but you know what's even more dangerous? Is trying to hang on to the old world that is going to disappear.
Isn't it a piece of advice that applies to a graduate of, say, Stanford or an Ivy League institution that doesn't quite apply to a young person that may fall through the cracks in a developing economy? Because the premise of development economics has been sort of graduating from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to services. And now all of a sudden, services, at least some of them, seem to disappear. The cost of them, the arbitrage, seems to disappear. So what should a person do if they are, say, in a mid-sized country, developing economy, and not necessarily have the pedigree from Stanford?
Yeah. I'm worried about that, and I don't know for sure how things are going to pan out because it's rapidly changing. But I think this is mostly a design problem, not a prediction problem. Rather than us sitting in our chairs and trying to predict what will happen, I think you want to go out and you want to design a system that benefits everybody, and you make choices. And I think that we are in a position now where we can make choices that benefit people. And I'll tell you why I'm optimistic about lots of people. Let me give you 3 reasons. First off, I did a study with Lindsay Raymond and Danielle Lee of people in call centers who are using an LLM to help them answer questions from people who are calling in. And the people who benefited the most were actually the least skilled and least experienced workers. They had about a 30 to 40% productivity gain. The most experienced workers had almost 0% productivity gain. So that difference actually helped the new workers more and the less skilled workers. Why was that? Well, because the LLM was trained on millions and millions of these transcripts. And some of them led to good outcomes and some of them led to bad outcomes. And the LLM basically said, we're going to give you more of the good answers instead of the bad answers. Where did the good answers come from? They came from the good agents. And so when the LLM was saying, oh, here's a question, let me show you the right answer. And it would tell the new worker, the worker was like, hey, this is great. Now I know how to answer that question. And then they would have that question, they would tell it to the experienced worker. And the experienced worker would say, of course, that's what I've been saying all along. You're not telling me anything new. So the LLM actually had a leveling force. Now, this doesn't always happen. I'm not saying this is always and everywhere the case, but in many cases, these tools are better for the less experienced people. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that LLMs are great at cognitive work. They're not good at physical work. An LLM can't pick up this glass here, okay? It can write a memo. It can do a careful legal analysis. It can do a medical diagnosis. And we just talked about solving the Erdos problem. So in many ways, LLMs, unlike earlier technologies, are now substituting for some of the most advanced tasks. And a lot of physical work, like what a nurse does, what a carpenter does, what a plumber does, they're not going to be replaced by an LLM. Maybe parts of it will be complemented. So there may actually be relatively more demand for some of these physical work. Now, this is all changing. Over time, we'll have robotics, et cetera. But in the next few years, I think we may see that some of the most skilled professions will have wages falling relative to those who are doing physical work. So those are a couple of the reasons why we may be able to see this become more widespread. And the third one is actually the most important and most profound. And that is, what do LLMs do? What LLMs do is, and AI agents, they are really good at executing once you've defined what the task is. But most problems have three parts to them. The first one is defining the question. What is it you need to work on? The second part is executing it, what I just talked about.
Right.
And the third part is evaluating. Was it done correctly? Do we need to change something? Through all of history, humans have done all three parts. There wasn't anyone else. Now, AI agents are getting very good at that executing part. But that makes it relatively more important to do the first and the third. Defining the right question, evaluating it. Well, that's something that somebody in a middle-income country, any country can do. They can say, here are some questions that really need to be addressed. And now, for the first time, they have some tools that can execute it. You don't have to be an expert coder to use Replit or Cursor. You can describe the problem to them, and then the tool will do a lot of that execution. So it empowers people who can understand what are the important problems, and now they have ways of solving them that they never had before, and they may need to evaluate them as well. So this, I think, is going to widely broaden the set of people who can contribute to creating solutions for the world. The scarce resource, the real valuable resource, will be defining the right questions. And I think that's something people anywhere on Earth can do, and it's something we can learn how to do better, ask the right questions. And going forward, I'd like to see more people focusing on that, not just in the United States, but in Poland, in Africa, in China, everywhere. People should be thinking, what are the big problems we need to have solved, and how can I give instructions to an agent to help solve that problem?
Well, that's on condition that they have access to compute, right? And
Correct.
you've mentioned the idea of giving universal compute. I mean, it works as long as the access to frontier intelligence models is priced at roughly $20 a month. You had a study of consumer surplus and how it accrues to customers.
Yeah, let me talk about that. So right now, it is widely used. I mean, 1 billion people or so are using ChatGPT, and it's free for a lot of them. For others, they pay $20. Some pay a few $100s if you want to use very advanced models. I mean, it's amazing that the price of intelligence, machine intelligence, has been falling so rapidly and widely accessible. And one big open question, I don't know the answer to it, is what is going to be the marginal price of getting better intelligence, and how much value is that going to be? There are a lot of problems that can be solved with existing levels of intelligence. Right now, of machine intelligence, I should say. Right now, I think there's a huge capabilities overhang. What that means is that none of us are using the existing capabilities as much as we should be using them. We're just scratching the surface. If the technology just froze right now and all the people in Silicon Valley decided to take a 10-year vacation, we would still, the rest of us, would still have a decade's worth of work figuring out how to take advantage of the technologies we have, the free stuff and other stuff. And so I think there's plenty of things we can do with existing models. That said, they're going to keep getting better, and other people are going to work on complicated protein folding problems and healthcare and rocketry and environmental challenges that couldn't be solved without advanced models. But just the basic stuff that you could do with the existing models is already quite important. And to your question about consumer surplus, we've measured this. And what we see is that the amount of consumer surplus that people are getting now is already about over $100 billion in the United States. Consumer surplus is defined as the most you'd be willing to pay for something versus what you actually have to pay for it.
And how much would we be willing to pay for ChatGPT or any of the frontier models?
I'm willing to pay thousands of dollars. I use them all the time, and other people may be willing to.
So shouldn't the labs price you at thousands of dollars?
This is the great thing about capitalism, is that there's competition, And if one of them tried to charge that much, another lab would charge less. And so as long as there's competition, then you end up having the price be much lower than the value. And that's exactly what Adam Smith wanted. He talked about the invisible hand. And one of the things that the invisible hand of the free market does when there's competition is it forces producers to compete against each other so they don't capture most of the value. Most of the value is captured by consumers. In fact, Bill Nordhaus, Nobel Prize winning economist, estimated that for most innovations, about 95% of the benefit goes to consumers and only 5% goes to the inventors or the creators of the innovation. Now, that still could be a lot of money for them, but the consumers are getting the vast majority of it. You know, these lights here, like we pay next to nothing for them, and we get a lot of value from them. Once upon a time, the cost of light was really, really high. You had to light a torch and, you know, get whale oil or whatever they did in the olden days. You know, now we just flick a switch, and I don't even think twice about leaving the lights on all night. If you have an LED light, maybe I should, but it's pennies. So we're seeing a world where there could be a lot of consumer surplus. In my study, what we found with my colleagues, what we found was that the amount of consumer surplus per person is steadily growing for these AI tools, and the number of people are using it is also growing. So we had, I have to check the numbers, but I think it was about a 50 or 60% increase in consumer surplus over the past year in the United States. And I'm sure it's similar in other countries as these tools create more and more value for consumers that they don't have to pay for. This is a tool we call GDP-B, and the B stands for benefits. So what we're measuring is the benefits people get. Traditional GDP measures all the things that people buy and sell in the economy, and with few exceptions, if something has zero price, it has zero value in GDP. So traditional GDP misses the value of all these free goods. But our measure, GDP-B, measures the benefits even when you don't have to pay for it. And for the 21st century, that's going to become more and more important because we're going to have more and more digital goods, more and more AI-enabled goods and services, and those are going to allow us to get lots of stuff without having to pay for it.
Was it also the case with fiber optic or railroads, where you had massive booms, massive investment, obviously, I mean, lots of consumer surplus going to people that can travel pretty much immediately as opposed to by a horse carriage from place A to B. But then there is the other side of the equation, right? There are the investors that truly believe that if they put $60 billion per gigawatt of compute, they are going to get it back on a reasonable timeline. So doesn't this measure point us to there being a bubble?
I don't know if there's a bubble. Nobody ever knows when there's a bubble for sure. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. I'm old enough, I lived through the internet. There was a bubble at the end, but also there's a lot of lasting value. And I think the same thing is true this time around. You know, back then, companies like Amazon and Google and Yahoo, got to be really important, and many of them are still worth trillions of dollars today, even more than they were back then. There are others like Pets.com and Webvan that temporarily had a boom and then a bust. I'm sure that some of the companies that exist today will go out of business. Others will grow. Investors are trying to pick which ones are which. Some investors are going to make a fortune. Many people already have made a fortune. I was with the family office of one of them last night at an event, and yeah, they probably added $50 billion to their net worth over the past year or so. So some of them are doing all right. I don't know if that's going to last for sure, but what I am very confident is that the fundamental value is going to last. This is much bigger than the internet. I think it's bigger than the Industrial Revolution, and it's happening 10 times faster. This is the most transformative technology that's ever happened for humans. In my book with Andy McAfee called The Second Machine Age, we talked about how earlier technologies like the steam engine, electricity, they mainly augmented our muscles and took it from humans and made it into machines, created a lot of wealth. You and I are perhaps 30 times richer than the people from before the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago, mainly because these technologies have augmented muscle power. Now we have machines that are augmenting minds, brain power. How can that not be at least as important? It's going to be even more important. To have a machine that has the intellectual capabilities that surpass what humans can do, it's obvious to me that's the greatest transformation, the greatest innovation in history.
Do we see that already in the productivity numbers?
No. We don't see it in the productivity numbers. And many people think that's a mystery. I don't think it's a mystery. One of my first papers, Bob Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, when I was a student, asked me to look into this. And I wrote a paper called The Productivity Paradox of Information Technology. Because back then, in the late 80s, Bob Solow commented that we see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity numbers. And he was right. That didn't mean computers were a dud. What it meant was that, first off, there's a measurement problem back then, just as today. And I told you how GDPB helps address that measurement problem. Many of the benefits of computers and many of the benefits of AI, they don't show up in GDP. And how do you measure productivity? Well, most people don't know this, but productivity is GDP divided by hours worked. So if you're not measuring GDP, you're not measuring productivity. And so we are mismeasuring productivity. That's a big problem. And GDPB is helping to address that. But there's an even bigger problem. And that is that the technology takes time to have its effect. Computers, electricity, the steam engine, those were all general purpose technologies. I used to just say GPT, but now people get mixed up what a GPT is. AI is also a GPT. It's a GPT of a general purpose technology. It's also, according to OpenAI, a generative pre-trained transformer. It's both those things, but I mean it as a general purpose technology. It's the most important general purpose technology of our era. The thing about general purpose technologies is that even when they're very powerful, in fact, especially when they're very powerful, it takes years, sometimes decades, for them to have the full impact on the economy. In the case of electricity, it took about 30 years, believe it or not, from when electric motors were introduced into factories until you had big productivity gains. And in my books, in my dissertation, I describe this in more detail, but the short version of it is that if you just put an electric motor in where the steam engine went, you don't get much productivity gain. You need to reinvent the factory, and then you get real value. Same thing is true of AI. Same thing is of every technology. You can get some value just by plugging AI into our old production process, but the big gains come from this transformation, and that involves new business processes, new organizational forms, new skills of workers. We talked about that before. These are all intangible assets. An intangible asset is something that's a real asset, but you can't touch it. It's called intangible. It's invisible, but it's very important. The U.S. economy is building up huge value of intangible assets. According to my work with Daniel Rock and Chad Severson, trillions of dollars of intangible assets are being created. They don't show up in GDP. They don't show up in the balance sheets. But in my opinion, they're real. They're new ways of doing business. And as we start harvesting the value from these intangible assets, then productivity will take off. But the net effect is that initially, while you're building the intangible assets, you have kind of a decline because you have more investment into new skills and business process. You're hiring people from Accenture and WorkHelix and elsewhere. And at first, the output doesn't go up. You're inventing new business processes. But then you start using those new processes, and then things take off. And so it looks like a J, kind of down at first, and then it takes off. And we are just at the turning point of that. So the first few years, you don't see a big effect. I think in the next 5 years, productivity is going to be much higher than what the Congressional Budget Office or most analysts are predicting. In fact, I'm so confident of it, I made a bet with my friend Bob Gordon. You can go to longbets.com. He's a great economist, one of the best. I have dinner with him every year. We just scheduled our next dinner for the Summer Institute in Cambridge. And he's, been skeptical about technology. So he bet me that productivity would not be growing much faster than the Congressional Budget Office predicts. I think it will. And by 2030, we're going to resolve the bet. And I'll tell you a little secret. I'm already ahead on that, and we haven't even hit the steep part of the J curve.
But to the point about long-term productivity growth, when we look at the past 200 years or so, it's been pretty much steady.
Yes, that's correct.
We obviously needed all of those GPTs to graduate and maintain that steady 2%. But there is talk in the Silicon Valley among some of the investors, some of the people certainly in the AI labs, about GDP growth in the order of 10%, 20%, and the likes. How much sense is there in those predictions?
Right. Well, so it's true. We've had steady productivity growth, bouncing around, but pretty close to 2% for 200 years. My colleague Chad Jones has documented this. It's almost like it's remarkable what a straight line it is on a log curve. Steady 2% for 200 years. But if you extend the curve a little bit further, you go back, say, 2,000 years, back to my friend Daedalus, et cetera, then productivity growth was much, much lower, less than 0.2%. So the Industrial Revolution that I described earlier was a phase change where we first started having this exponential growth at 2%. I think we're due for another phase change with the second machine age, with AI and augmenting our minds. And I do think it could ultimately lead to 10 times higher productivity growth. My prediction for the next few years is not 20% productivity growth, but just 3 to 4% productivity growth, which is much higher than the Congressional Budget Office or others. But it'll keep going up for a while. And I don't want to make predictions too far out into the future, but there's no law of physics that prevents it from growing a good deal faster than 3 or 4%. I know that some of my friends at the Frontier Labs who are technologists, they do talk about 20, 50, 100% productivity growth. And if you only look at the computer side of things, you can see some really amazing things happening, especially when you get into RSI, recursive self-improvement, where the machines are improving themselves and AI is building more AI. But what I don't think they fully appreciate is the J-curve and the fact that there are many, many bottlenecks in the economy that tend to slow things down, and we have to take into account those. So I put myself somewhere at the logarithmic mean or the geometric mean between the AI folks with these extremely high productivity numbers and the traditional economists in Washington, New York, and London who think we're just going to keep doing what we did in the past. Somewhere in the middle is where I am.
Why are traditional economists still so skeptical?
I'm trying to persuade them. I think most of it just has to do with they haven't spent enough time looking at the technology. The thing that I find most convincing is just working with the technology and how it's changing my daily life.
And how does it change your daily life and your work?
I have such fun working with Claude Cowork, writing new papers or having Gemini research things for me. The iteration is at least 10 times faster. You know, my normal kind of work process is I meet with these incredibly smart graduate students from MIT and Stanford and elsewhere, and we talk about a project, and I say, hey, you know, what about this hypothesis? You know, why don't you go out and get the data, do some analyses, and then we meet a week later, and they've shown me what they've done. I was like, oh, that's interesting, but you know, we didn't consider this, and you know, that's unexpected. Why don't we explore this? And we kind of iterate, and over a period of weeks or sometimes months, you know, we get to a better and better paper. Now with Claude Cowork, I had this idea, and I tell it to go, you know, explore it. And 10 minutes later, it comes back with a bunch of analyses. And again, I say, oh, that's not quite right. Oh, it looks like you made a mistake here. Or this is really unexpected, you know, gather this data. And then I just ask it again. And now we're just cycling, you know, sometimes till late in the night because it's such fun. I mean, one of the most gratifying things to me is getting something accomplished. That's where I get the most fun. And things are just happening a lot faster. But it's not just, you know, me as a professor. You know, lawyers are seeing that they can do documents faster. Doctors can diagnose things faster. Investment bankers can analyze a company faster. Every kind of cognitive work is being changed. You know, coding most of all, where it's been completely transformed, where, you know, at our company, WorkHelix, our coders, our engineers, you know, they are now each managing fleets of agents that are going out and generating code for them using lots of tokens, but generating stuff very, very quickly. So when you see this happening, and you see it happening in all the companies, you know, it's just obvious that there's a transition. The other thing that's obvious is that most companies, most people aren't living in that world. This is a tiny fraction. And what I see at my company, WorkHelix, we go visit lots of clients. And almost everyone, no, I will say everyone that we visit has the same pattern where there's a power law distribution of users. There's a few super users, maybe 3%, 5% of the users who are using the technology very effectively, getting 10x productivity gains. as a sales and marketing person, as a coder, as a customer service person, and other areas in R&D. But the long tail, most people, and the median worker is just using AI basically to write better emails, more eloquent emails, or maybe summarizing a document. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not a quantum change. It's a small change in their productivity. If we could take that average worker, that median worker, and get them just halfway to the level of the super user, that would be a huge productivity gain. I have no doubt that's going to happen. My company, WorkHelix, has this mission to have that happen to more and more companies around the world, and especially our immediate clients. And as we do that, we're going to see a big productivity gain. But it takes time.
Coming back to your work as a professor, I mentioned, and we've talked about the Erdos problem, and mathematicians these days worry that they are going to go the way of chess, or Go, at least to some extent.
Yeah.
Do you worry the same thing is going to happen with economics and your profession?
A little bit. I think first off, it's worth noting that the average human chess player today is much better than they were before computer chess. The average Go player is much better. So these tools have made humans better. It's also worth noting that, I have to double check this, but I believe there's actually more people playing chess now than there was before computer. So it hasn't made them worse, and it hasn't eliminated them. That said,
I'm more so trying to get at the sense of purpose.
Yeah, the sense of purpose. So let me get to that. So I think, with all due respect to my very smart friends who play chess, etc., it's 8 squares by 8 squares with very well-defined rules, okay? It's a tiny, massively oversimplified version of the world. The real world that economists study is orders of magnitude more complex. And so we're very far from solving it in the same way. And I think for a long time, there's going to be a partnership. With chess, there was this period after Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in 1998. Garry Kasparov created something called freestyle chess, or team chess, where humans and machines would play against other humans and machines. And he showed that a team of humans and machines could beat the best chess computer, could beat Deep Blue. Humans added something, machines added something, and they could beat the best machine, they could beat the best human. Now, critics will point out, okay, but that period ended. It lasted for, 8 or 10 years or so. And eventually now, today, a human and machine has nothing to add versus a machine by itself. AlphaZero can beat the human and machine team because the human just can't keep up.
I mean, the progress itself also accelerated. Like you've mentioned recursive self-improvement, right?
But that was 8 years, and that was for this very simple game of 8 squares by 8 squares. The rest of the world is so much more complicated. And so I think this period where humans and machines can work together is going to be much more than 8 years. It may be decades. And during that period, economists like me can use the tools to explore new questions. And that 3-part division, ask the right questions, execute, and then evaluate, it applies to coding, and it applies to economics, it applies to many problems. And I think that my comparative advantage is going to be in defining the questions. The machines will help with the executing, and both of us will work on the evaluating it together. So that's my vision in science, in economics, in biology, and in politics, that humans and machines will work together. And we are actually creating new benchmarks. We call them centaur benchmarks. The ancient Greeks had this mythical animal, half human, half horse. I think we should think about teams that are half human, half machine to solve the problems. One of the big mistakes I think the AI field has made is that almost all of the benchmarks are meant to be solved by an AI by itself. I helped create something called the AI Index, which is this report that comes out once a year, the Stanford AI Index, about 500 pages of charts about AI progress. And there are all these lines that are going up and to the right of how AI can solve different problems faster and faster, which is great. But very few of those benchmarks have a human and machine working together. It's almost always the machine by itself. And that's a problem because AI researchers are very good at solving benchmarks. If somebody publishes a benchmark, often within a few years or sometimes even a few months, a team of AI researchers saturates that benchmark. We figured out how to solve it. And they're publishing benchmarks that are meant for just machines. Andy Hopt and I are working on Centaur benchmarks where it's not cheating for the human to help the machine or for the machine to help the human. In fact, that's the whole point. And now what we want to do is have people build teams that can do problems that no machine could have done by itself or no human. And I think that's going to be ultimately create much more value than these standalone systems.
But like, be it in college or be it in professional services, academia, etc. Like in all of the professions where there is an apprenticeship model, an integral part of being an apprentice is executing.
Right.
And right now, if you're even a college student, not even like an investment banker or a lawyer or what have you, it's so easy to offload a task to AI that the entire process of learning by execution is somehow lost.
I think it's a problem, but I don't want to overstate that problem. I think that you really do know how to do arithmetic before you use a calculator. You should know how to write an essay before you have GPT write the essay for you. And the best way to do that is to do it yourself many, many times. That said, over time, I do think the set of tasks that humans focus on is going to evolve a little bit. Before in the time before calculators, a lot of people in classes were learning how to do the square root of a 5-digit number by hand. I don't know how many people can do that now. I don't think it matters that most people can't do it. They understand the concept of the square root, but the calculator will do it. Or to go even further, back to my favorite Greek stories. I used to read a lot of Greek mythology when I was a kid. But Socrates, who was not a mythical person, he was a real person, he thought it was terrible that we had invented what? Reading and writing.
Writing, right.
Big mistake. He said, now people are not going to memorize the epic poems. Instead of memorizing the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're just going to read it. Makes your mind weak and flabby. I think he was wrong. I think that we could spend a lot of time memorizing those poems, and maybe it has a certain, mental discipline, but those cycles would be better spent on other things. And reading and writing, we can learn from lots of different things. And so over time, we need to evolve. And I think what our schools should be teaching, what I try to teach in my class, is how do we use these tools how do we ask the right questions and point the tools in the right places. We do need to learn how things work, but the set of tasks that we are strong at changes. I think companies need to evolve how they onboard people. It used to be they could give them some sort of boring work, and then incidentally they would learn about the company just by bumping into their senior colleagues. It worked okay. Now they have to be much more intentional. It doesn't work to give them a box of legal documents and say, run through these documents and try and find all the cases that we're looking for, because a machine can do that. And so you're not going to hire people to do all that scut work. Instead, when you hire people, you need to consciously train them, not hope that they accidentally learn by hanging around smart people, but use an AI and train them. Infosys, I was talking to them. They have not cut back their junior hiring. They're still hiring as many people. They don't have as much routine work for them to do, so they're using those hours instead to train them using AI tools. And now they're getting them up to speed much faster. I think that's a kind of model that can work. I also want to be fair. I don't think every company can afford to do that. Not every individual worker can afford to train themselves. So we need to rely on a third group. And the third group that historically we've relied on is the public sector. Education and training is a public good. It has spillovers. It creates value beyond the individual person who makes the investment. And that's why historically governments have invested in public goods. The United States used to be a leader in education. In the 1820s, it started the public education for 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And other countries in Europe and elsewhere thought they were foolish to be taking people off of the farm and training them. But we all can look back and say, actually, it was a good investment. In the 1920s, there was the high school movement where they got people to go and get 10th, 11th, 12th grade. And later there was the GI Bill where people went to college. Each of these eras, the United States led the world with the most educated population. And it's not a coincidence they also had some of the highest productivity and highest economic growth. The The U.S. is no longer the leader in education, and I think that's a bad sign for the future. A country that wants to lead the world in economic growth also has to lead the world in education.
One last question that I have for you is also the question that we ask to all of our guests. If you could find out an answer to one question about the economy, the world, the universe as a whole, what would it be?
The question that I'm most interested right now is how we can not only create a lot of wealth, but also create shared prosperity. I'm confident that the technology is going to be incredibly powerful at transforming the world and helping to cure diseases, help the environment, and lift many people potentially out of poverty. My concern is that it could also lead to greater concentration of economic power and political power. I don't think it's inevitable, but I think we want to be very careful about that. Historically, Friedrich Hayek showed that it was very hard to concentrate all decision-making because knowledge was dispersed and our brains could only handle so much information, so you had to distribute the processing. That's not necessarily true going forward as AI is able to potentially concentrate a lot of the information and a lot of the processing power. And the question I have is how can we make sure that we create widely shared benefits for people, not just concentrated power? I believe these very powerful tools are going to usher in a period of tremendous transformation, but I also want to assure us to have freedom and shared prosperity going forward. And as the capabilities keep rising, we need to reinvent our economic institutions so we have the tools to make sure that we all benefit from this wondrous technology. That's the focus I have at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. That's the focus of my research.
What do you mean specifically by AI concentrating all of that compute? Like, could AI potentially solve the question that the free market is solving?
I think there's much more potential for that in the past. Zoe Hitzig and I have written a paper called AI's Use of Knowledge in Society, where we analyze this case. And Friedrich Hayek said that there's all this detailed knowledge about people's tastes, about whether a truck is empty or full or partly full, and all sorts of other local knowledge that no one entity has. That's not true anymore. If you go to Bentonville, Arkansas, the headquarters of Walmart, they have detailed information about what people want in every different neighborhood, better than the average shopkeeper does. They have detailed information about where all the trucks are and which ones are full.
Sounds almost like central planning.
Walmart is the epitome of central planning far more than Friedrich Hayek or his socialist adversaries ever could have imagined. It's the most centrally planned entity on the planet in many ways. Furthermore, it even is getting information about tastes, and so there is the potential for that, and also it has processing power far beyond any human brain to calculate how all these things connect. Now, at the same time, there's new opportunities for innovation, and so we got to find the right balance. In the past, it was impossible to centralize that much information. Now it's possible, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be the only outcome. I'm not saying that this is a prediction that we'll have centralization. What I'm saying is that we have to keep our eyes on the ball here and manage an economic system that keeps power widely dispersed and distributed if we want to have freedom, because political freedom is the ally of economic freedom. And if we have both those things, we're more likely to be able to use these tools in a way that creates widely shared prosperity. I don't think we have figured out the economic system quite yet that's going to manage all of those things simultaneously. It would be a miracle if the economic system didn't change, given the massive changes in information processing capacity. Markets and hierarchies are both information processors, and now we have massive changes in our ability to use machines to process information, orders of magnitude changes, many orders of magnitude changes, and that means we have to think about how our institutions can keep up. And there's a bigger and bigger gap between the capabilities in our institutions, and that gap is where the greatest challenges of the next decade lie, as well as the greatest opportunities. That's what my work is focused on.
Thank you so much, Erik. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.